Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my comprehensive AD carry tutorial and guide. So, I'm going to be, in this video series, talking about literally everything you need to know about AD carries, from level 1 all the way through to Diamond. We're going to be talking about them from the basics, all the way to the most advanced tactics and strategies and knowledge that you will need in order to play AD carry at the highest possible level. I really aim for this to be comprehensive. In fact, originally when I started working on this video about 6 months ago, it was intended to be a single video, but as I collected more and more information, it morphed into a series, and is in fact going to be a 5-video series. So we're going to be going through this in 5 parts, each of which is going to contain a significant amount of information. So by the time we're done, we'll have a truly complete look at AD carries. Couple quick disclaimers before we begin. First, all information included in these videos is going to be current only as of the date of posting of the videos, and some of the clips that I use are going to be older than the date of posting. So if you're watching this 2 years from now, things will have changed, and a few things will be different, but most of the basics will remain the same, almost certainly, and you'll be able to apply all the principles, if not necessarily the specifics. Of course, that doesn't apply to most of you who will be watching this right after it comes out, so you'll get all of the information. The other thing that I need to say is that, of course, everything I say in this video is only my own opinion, but you already know that because I'm the one talking. I aim for this series to be useful both to completely new players and to veterans. This video will contain basic information, but stated in an explicit and clear way that will help veterans to categorize and think about it in a way they almost certainly have not before, giving you a deeper understanding of AD carries. So hopefully, at least the plan is, that new players will find it interesting because there will be a whole lot of information that they don't have, and veteran players will find it interesting because there will be information that they do have, but presented in a way that makes it really clear why this information is important. So, without further ado, let's begin. Alright, in part 1 of this series, which is this one, we're going to be starting from the beginning. So we're going to be talking about what an AD carry is and why it's important to a team, and the types of AD carry, because within the role there are various different types which fulfill a different function on each team. We'll also be going over each hero that is an AD carry and talking about what type of AD carry they are and why. And then finally we're going to be wrapping up with some common terminology and usage just to get everyone on the same page, so that I'm not using words that people don't know, because that won't aid understanding at all for future parts. In part 2, which will come later, I'm planning to release each part probably once a week for the next several weeks until each part is released. In part 2, we'll be covering all the things that you need to know before you go into a game, like runes, masteries, and summoners, item builds and plans for item builds, and what to do on each champion, and how to change your item build in certain situations, and how to manage your gold, and adapting your build to situations. In part 3, we'll be talking about the early game, so laning, lane management, and farming, gold flow and the importance of maintaining it and the best ways to maintain it, the role of support in it with AD carries, because of course you can't talk about AD carries without talking about supports and the dynamics of the duo lane and what you're supposed to be doing there, and just the general early game mindset that you should have as an AD carry in the first 10 to 15 to 20 minutes of the game, depending on how long the early game lasts. In part 4, we're going to get into the real meat of the subject and talk about the point of the game where the AD carry really comes into its own. So we'll be discussing team fights, positioning, and targeting, how to, win the game, pushing and sieging, and what you should be doing during those pushes and sieges, and things that you should be thinking about there, and just the general mid to late game mindset of the AD carry, and how to sort of win games as an AD carry. And in part 5, we'll wrap it all up, bring everything together, mention a few exceptions and special cases to the rules, just to make sure that everything is clear, and just really finalize this as a truly comprehensive guide. So, I hope you guys are ready to learn everything you ever wanted to know about AD carries, and a lot of stuff you probably didn't, because that is what we're going to do. So let's start. What is an AD carry? Obviously a very simple question that we need to ask. So an AD carry is a champion in League of Legends, AD standing for attack damage, that is the champion on your team that uses gold the best. So if given an equal amount of gold, an AD carry will gain more effectiveness by spending that gold than any other champion in the game. You usually start weaker, but you become so much stronger because every bit of gold that you get is more valuable than every bit of gold that someone else gets. All gold is not created equal, and all items are not created equal. So you as a champion have a skill set and a basic chassis that allows you to use items better than anyone else. You also, so in order for this to be the case, the champion requires a few things. It needs a long-range basic attack. This is non-negotiable. Every AD carry has to have a long-range basic attack. You can't have a melee AD carry. You can have melee carries, but they're not an AD carry as we understand it. I'll talk about what the word carry means and how to apply that in a second. You need basic statistics, so the base of your champion, the numbers behind your champion, that give you high damage. Not necessarily starting at level 1, but usually high damage growth per level, so as you gain levels, your base damage goes up, and high attack speed gain. Those are the two critical statistics for AD carries, so champions that have both of those are good at AD carries. Also critical is an attack steroid, and a steroid, what that means is a skill that allows you to use gold better, so a skill that improves your items. An example of this is a skill that increases your attack speed, because if you attack faster, you are getting more value out of any item you buy that gives you attack damage. So, for example, if you have an Infinity Edge and you're hitting twice a second with it, that Infinity Edge is twice as valuable if you're hitting once a second with it. So a champion that can increase its attack speed is getting more value out of that Infinity Edge than a champion that cannot. Therefore, so that's what a steroid is something that improves the gold value of your items by a skill, being a skill. And almost every AD carry has a steroid. The next one, which is very useful, and all the best AD carries have this, but isn't critical, is a positioning or escape skill, something to allow your AD carry to move around, to evade enemies, to run away from people, which you'll end up doing a lot, and to make sure that you're always in a good position. And usually they'll come with a lane management or dueling skill, which is a nuke of some kind, like a burst damage spell, or something that will allow them to push creeps very quickly, or something that will allow them to knock the enemy out of the lane by doing a lot of damage to them or threatening to kill them. And usually this will take the form of an ability that scales with damage, so gains more damage based on how much damage you have from your items, and does damage to the opponent. A good example of this is Graves' Buckshot, is a lane management and dueling skill because it both pushes and does damage to the opponent, or Tristana's Explosive Shot, which pushes and can also be used to do damage to the opponent. So those things are critical for having an AD carry, but more importantly we need to know why we want an AD carry. And the simple answer is the gold usage. You use gold better than everyone else. So you want an AD carry so that you can put the gold that your team is going to get to its maximum possible value. The more, if you have an AD carry who's getting gold, then that gold is better than if you didn't have an AD carry who was getting gold. It just simply increases the overall value of your team to have an AD carry. The reason you don't want, your whole team to be AD carries is because they tend to be weak early game, so having more than one of them will split up the gold between them, so you'll get less concentrated powerful gold, because concentrating your gold on a single hero is almost always better than splitting it across multiple heroes, because of the way item breakpoints work, which we'll talk about later. And they tend to be very vulnerable early, so as an AD carry you're going to, if you only have AD carries and no one to protect you, probably get pushed out of lane and just not get as much gold. But all other things being equal, if you have gold, you're going to use it better than everyone else. A fully built AD carry, an AD carry with 6 items, is a more dangerous hero than any other hero with 6 items. So if everyone maxes out on gold, the AD carries are going to be the most dangerous heroes in the game. This is because they have the steroid skills, which allow them to do the most total damage output. When your damage comes primarily from a basic attack, it's damage that has an extremely low cooldown. And if you can apply it at range, it means that, as AD carries can, it means that you can apply it consistently. So your DPS, your damage per second, is the highest possible when you're playing an AD carry. They do more damage per second, or over the course of a full team fight or a full game, they will do more damage than anyone else. So if you have an AD carry, it just increases your overall damage output. Furthermore, AD carries are critical for knocking down turrets, because they are champions who have very high damage at very long range, and often can hit very quickly, which means that you don't have to get up next to the turret, which makes you vulnerable, but you can still hit it repeatedly and for a lot of damage and knock it down very quickly. So when you're trying to kill a turret, an AD carry is the most efficient way to do it. Also, the fact that you're long-ranged and very high threat forces the opponents to attack you, which means that they have to run through your teammates in order to get at you, because if they don't kill you, they'll lose. This means that enemies, by the very fact that you exist as a ranged attack damage carry, forces the enemies to put themselves in bad positions. It makes them play worse, and because you exist. So that is an extremely powerful effect. And finally, AD carries, again because of their damage output and because they don't spend cooldowns on doing damage. So a mage has to use a cooldown in order to do their damage, but you don't. You're the only character class that's capable of knocking down tanks, enemies who buy a ton of defense. If an enemy buys a ton of defense and a mage spends a nuke on it, they've used an important skill, while not doing very much damage, relatively speaking, because of the high resistances and high health of the enemy they attacked it on. But if you use an auto attack on it, it doesn't cost you anything, really. It costs you just the time that it took to fire that auto attack, which is very, very low, which means that you are perfectly suited to cutting down the enemy front line and taking them out, which is something that we'll talk about in Part 4 in a lot of depth when we get into how to target and how to manage your damage in a team fight. So, next up, we need to talk about who the AD carries are in a game of League of Legends. Currently, as of the time of posting of this video, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 AD carries, as well as a few champions who can sort of fill the role that I haven't included, because we'll talk about them sort of under exceptions and like special cases in Part 5. Broadly speaking, these can be divided into 3 categories. AD carries that focus on lane dominance, in other words, champions that don't have the raw late game power of the late game power champions, so they will not do as much damage if they get to maximum gold as those champions will, but make up for it by being slightly better early, allowing them to gain more gold total than a late game power champion will by beating them in lane, forcing them to miss last hits, maybe getting kills. The champions that fall into this role are Caitlyn, Draven, Graves, Misfortune, Urgot, Varus, and I have placed Lucian there, although I have to say I have to include a caveat, because Lucian is literally being patched into the game as I'm recording this video, so I have only my having read his skill set and seen the champion spotlight to go on when I say this. Intuitively to me, his skill set looks like a lane dominance champion. None of his skills have utility, so he's clearly not a utility champion. And it looks like he's more focused on winning the early game than the late game, but I could be wrong about that, so take that statement with a grain of salt. The next category is late game power champions, and there's really only 3 in League champions that, when maxed out, just are nigh unbeatable. Those are Kog'Maw, Tristana, and Vayne. And finally, utility AD carries who don't have the early game power, the lane dominating power of a lane dominance champion, or the raw damage potential of a late game power champion, but make up for it by providing the team with some kind of utility, like AoE damage in a team fight, or good positioning, or long range CC. And those champions are Ashe, Corki, Ezreal, sort of Quinn, we'll talk about Quinn in a second, and Sivir. So, why do each of these champions fall into each of these categories? I think it's worth talking about this so that we get a feel for what we're talking about when we talk about this. So let's start with the lane dominance champions. So the reason that Caitlyn tends to win lanes very effectively is she has a very long range, allowing her to hit the enemy without being retaliated in lane. As well, she has Headshot, which does burst damage for free on a pretty short cooldown. All you have to do is attack 7 times and you get a free burst damage. She also pushes very quickly with Piltover Peacemaker, which allows her to shove the creeps into the enemy turret, costing the enemy last hits. And finally gets to play pretty safe to ganks because she has 2 good evade skills in the form of traps and net, which allows her to push up and still be relatively safe. Which means that Caitlyn, in general, is a lane bully. What she's trying to do is harass the enemy and make them get so low, harass the enemy and make them get so low that they're unable to step up to last hit. The trade-off with this is that Caitlyn doesn't really have a good steroid skill. We talked about this earlier. Her best steroid skill is Headshot, which is much more of a laning tool than it is a steroid skill. So she does not use items as well as other AD carries, because she has no skill that improves the value of her items. Draven is, and Misfortune, I think we can include both of those together, are champions who just do so much damage when you stand and fight them, that no other champion in the game can just stand toe-to-toe and fight them. Draven will just out-damage you. Misfortune will just out-damage you because their attack speed and base damage is so high at early levels that you will just lose those battles, which means that they are able to play very aggressively in lane and push the other AD carry out, preventing them from farming. Draven gets all of this damage power from his spinning axes, which just do a tremendous amount of damage potential. And of course his passive rewards him for this playstyle, because if he gets kills early, it gives him a huge gold boost. Misfortune gets this damage potential from impure shots, because the stacking damage means that you can't stand toe-to-toe with her, because her damage gets so much higher, and from double up, which is just a very powerful nuke, especially if you can land it on both enemy champions in the lane. These champions, the trade-off for them is that they don't have good positioning skills. So even though both of them have good steroids, because both of them come with attack speed boosts, it's very easy for them to get popped later in the game by a burst damage champion, because they don't have a good way of avoiding them. Graves is a burst damage champion, which means that he's able to, when combined with another champion that does a whole lot of damage at once, just 100 to 0 an enemy, take them from full health to 0 health, which means that he gets lane dominance in there. He loses out again in terms of late game power because his range isn't very strong, and range is the most critical skill in the late game because it's what allows you to continue attacking uninterrupted. Graves' low range really punishes him in the late game because he is sort of forced to get up close and personal with the enemies, which is exactly where you don't want to be as an AD carry. Urgot has a similar role to Draven and Misfortune in that if he lands his Acid Bomb and can start hitting you with Acid Hunters, he just does more damage than anyone else. And that's extremely powerful. But he also really, really suffers from his bad range. Urgot is probably one of the weakest AD carries, and is really sort of an AD carry bruiser hybrid and not a true AD carry, which is why you don't see him that often in the bottom lane, because he relies so heavily on getting up close and personal with people, which detracts from his late game power significantly. Varus is... I've put him as a lane dominance champion because, again, he has very high burst damage and no positioning skills, which is sort of the hallmark of a burst damage champion. But he could easily be called a utility champion because his ultimate is so good for locking down the enemies. He provides a lot of teamfight utility as in addition to his burst damage, but I think mostly what you're trying to do with Varus is get kills. I also notice that I have pardon me, I have screwed up my chart here. I've noticed that I've forgotten Twitch. I think that was because of just a little bit of I screwed up the thing, so I'll just real quick add Twitch to this under late game power, and we'll talk about that right now. So the late game power champions all pretty much have a similar trait in that their steroids are the most powerful. They have abilities that increase the value of their items so significantly that those items become incredibly powerful. Kog'Maw gains a steroid that does percentage damage on every hit, which means that his attack items that give him attack speed become incredibly valuable because they apply that percentage damage every hit. So Kog'Maw buying attack speed items is just better than anyone else buying attack speed items. Also, that same skill gives him enormous range, allowing him to do this high percentage damage uninterrupted at a very long range, very safely, and very constantly. Tristana has a similar role in that she has an excellent steroid, one of the highest attack speed boosts in the game, which means that any flat damage items she buys become much more effective or flat damage or critical strike items that she buys become much more effective because she gets to apply that damage more often. As well, her passive increases her range, allowing her to apply that damage frequently and consistently. Tristana is an interesting case because she actually also is a lane dominance champion. She sort of falls off in the mid game but has very powerful early laning. But really you pick Tristana for the late game power because if you get to the late game, if you get to 6 items as Tristana, she's one of the best champions in the game. Vayne has a similar thing to Kog'Maw in that she has, in fact, she has not only the single best steroid skill in the game in Silver Bolts, which does not only percentage damage, which is very powerful in the late game when enemies have a lot of health, but percentage true damage, meaning she just ignores armor and magic resist from the enemies, just invalidating enemy items at the same time as she vastly increases the strength of her own items, her own attack speed items, which allow her to apply the Silver Bolts effect more frequently. She also gains effectiveness on attack speed items from the flat damage from her ultimate, and effectiveness on flat damage items from the auto attack timer reset on Tumble. As in, when you attack and then cast Tumble, you can auto attack again, use a basic attack again, without having to wait the normal amount of time between basic attacks. So this allows her to use basic attacks more frequently, thereby increasing the value of her items that increase her attack damage. Twitch is the final late game power champion, and it's all for his ultimate. Twitch's ultimate lets him hit everybody in a big ass line, and what that means is that his items are like when he makes an auto attack and he hits 5 people, his item it's like another champion making 5 attacks. So his items are working 5 times as hard as anyone else's items because he's just hitting everybody. Plus, he has an attack speed increase from his stealth. So Twitch has 2 incredibly strong steroids, and his ultimate increases his range, letting him do so very safely. The utility champions are a bit more complex, and usually they are utility champions because they provide a benefit to the team as a whole, rather than sort of just to themselves. So Ashe lets you land an arrow, which can get you her Enchanted Crystal Arrow and her slowing effect. Really helps her team out because slows are very good. They let your team land skill shots more easily. They'll let you chase people down. They'll let you run away. An Enchanted Crystal Arrow can catch an enemy who's out of position and just kill them instantly. Corki does a lot of AoE damage, which means that he can sort of and armor shred and stuff, which means that he really helps out a team that has a lot of AoE damage. The reason I've put Corki under utility rather than late game power is that Corki doesn't really scale with items that well, and he's not really a lane dominance champion either because he's not that strong early. Corki unfortunately just isn't very strong right now, which is one of the problems, but he does provide that AoE damage, which lets him fit into a team composition that does that. Ezreal's ability to position himself and buff his allies' attack speed and do damage from long range. Usually Ezreal's will buy an Iceborne Gauntlet, allowing them to do damage and slow from a long range. And the poke and siege power that he gives you as a result of that means that he's definitely much more of a utility champion. He's not the strongest champion in lane because his early base damage is not that high, and he's not the strongest champion late game because he doesn't actually have a good steroid or skills that really scale his items or his gold income very well. But what he does have is nigh inability to be killed, because Arcane Shift is such a powerful positioning tool, and the ability to apply damage consistently at long range using Mystic Shot. Quinn, I think, is supposed to be a utility champion. The goal for Quinn, I think, is to sort of like, you know, blind people, give vision with her the skill that gives vision, roam and help other lanes using the fast movement speed from her ultimate. But the problem with Quinn at the moment is that her base statistics and her skill set and her animations and just everything about that champion simply don't support what she's trying to do. The champion is just too weak in order to achieve what she's trying to do. So I think she's intended to be a utility champion, but in actual reality just isn't a champion. And so that's kind of a problem. Quinn needs a buff at the time of this posting. And finally, Sivir is mainly about her ultimate. It allows her teammates to gain just this incredible movement speed boost, which is very powerful for a team, and gives you a massive advantage in team fights, in chasing situations, in running away situations. Again, not the most powerful champion in late game, because she has basically, her steroid is not super strong, but good utility in that she can survive stuns using her spell shield, and she can run around, and decent lane dominance because she does have 2 powerful nukes. So if you wanted to put Sivir not under utility, you would put her under lane dominance. So hopefully that's a decent overview of all of the AD carries and the roles that they fill in a team, and sort of what that means for when you're playing them. So obviously, when you're playing a lane dominance champion, you should be looking to win early. You should be looking to put the hurt on the enemy, get more CS than them. When you're playing a late game power champion, you should just be looking to survive. And when you're playing a utility champion, you should be looking to use what makes your champion uniquely powerful to gain an advantage that you couldn't otherwise have. So like, if you're playing Ashe and you're not landing a lot of stuns and arrows, then you should just not be playing Ashe. If you're playing Ezreal and not forcing the enemies to run through your team to you and then blinking away, or applying a lot of slows at long range using Iceborne Gauntlet, or buffing your allies' attack speed, then you just shouldn't be playing Ezreal, and so on and so forth. And finally, we're just going to go over some common terminology, just things that you will need to know for future parts of this video. A few of these words I've already used, so hopefully this will clarify it if you didn't know what I was talking about, although hopefully you can infer from context. So just like, these are just a few words that we're going to be using a lot that you should probably know. So last hitting, when I say last hitting, what I mean by that is just killing a minion and gaining gold from killing a minion, because whenever you kill a minion, you gain gold. Farming means last hitting a lot for a long time. If you sit in a lane, last hitting every minion, gaining lots of gold over time, then that's called farming. In order to facilitate farming, sometimes you'll do what's called freezing, which is just keep the lane in a single place by making sure that your opponents have slightly more creeps than you. So your creeps always die slightly faster, and then just last hitting your opponent's creeps as they get low, which will prevent the lane from moving, because the creeps will die at exactly the same rate, so they will it will never, where the minions are fighting, will never move. And usually you want to do this near your tower, so you can farm safely, not be exposed to enemy ganking or roaming, or so that you can deny or zone your opponents by preventing them from coming near you, because they would be dangerously exposed if they did so. A wave of minions is just, every 30 seconds a group of minions spawns. There's 3 ranged and 3 melee minions, and every second wave there's also a cannon minion. That's just 1 wave. So you'll talk about like missing a wave or getting a wave, and that means that you were present or absent in the lane for that wave of creeps, and that's a very important thing to be paying attention to. We'll also talk a lot about evading ganks, and what ganking means is when someone attacks your lane from the jungle or from another lane, giving them a local numerical advantage and forcing kills or doing a lot of damage and forcing people out, making you spend long, expensive cooldowns like summoner spells, things like that. So you want to make sure that you either don't get ganked or don't die when you do get ganked and don't lose too much. And it's important to know what ganking is in order to be able to avoid it, because as an AD carry, you won't be ganking, you will be ganked a lot. Later in the game, teams will often do something called sieging, which is basically you sort of sit in front of the enemy turret, neither team positioning your team in such a way that neither team can really start a fight, them because they'll have to jump through your tank lines, and you because you'll have to jump into the enemy turret. While waves of creeps show up, and the turret attacks them, and then you hit the turret from long range, so you slowly get damage on it. As an AD carry, you're critical to this exercise, because usually you're the only person on a team who has long enough range to actually hit the turret, and high enough damage to actually do anything worthwhile when they do hit the turret. We'll also be talking a lot about team fight positioning, which is just the exercise of placing and moving your character in such a way as you can keep attacking and you can't get attacked. You're going to be using walls, you're going to be using walls in the form of allies, and you're going to be using your spells a lot in order to ensure good positioning. And we'll talk about what it means to have good positioning and how to make sure you have good positioning later on. Some more laning terminology. Zoning and denying are basically just threatening the enemy by creating an area of peril, a zone that they cannot enter, or they'll die, whether because your jungler will come gank, or you are stronger than them so you can just jump on them and kill them, or it just puts them in a really dangerous spot, and preventing them from getting close to the creep wave. Creeps is another word for minions also. And losing gold and XP. If you can zone or deny your opponents by getting a health or item advantage on them, or level advantage on them, all things we'll talk about when we talk about the laning phase, then you are in a good shape to just really punish the enemy. So, this was part 1. It was really mainly set up for future parts, but hopefully we've covered a bunch of things that are useful and interesting. And please leave comments if I have missed anything or if you have any questions. And as always, feel free to comment, rate, and subscribe to my channel. And stay tuned for parts 2 through 5, when we'll be discussing runes, masteries, summoner spells, and items in part 2, laning in the early game in part 3, team fighting in the mid to late game in part 4, and bringing it all together for a comprehensive approach to playing an AD carry in part 5. Once again, I am Eteran. Thank you for watching. Cheers, folks. GG.